I don't really eat chocolate pecan pie or pecan pie in general.
Either one.
But
Not a nut fan myself.
Jeremy?
Yeah, I like a pecan pie.
You heard it there first.
I don't like the chocolate pecan pie. Just give me a normal pecan pie. Nuts are healthy. Protein gives you strong muscles.
Yeah, that's what I think of when I think of pecan pie.
Mm-hmm.
Pies in general. Yeah.
Apple pie, that's fruit. Apples are 0 points for Weight Watchers. So.
Oh. Wow, we're an informational podcast as well. Weight Watchers.
There's a lot of other things in pie. I don't know if you know this, Jeremy. It's not just the apple that's in the apple pie.
There's still apples in it.
Cinnamon, which
that's a vegetable. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so lemonade as well. I feel like lemonade, I'm not a big fan. I don't like it.
Yeah, I feel like it's okay.
I'd rather have an Arnold Palmer.
I actually had lemonade this weekend, though. There was a girl in our neighborhood doing the classic garage sale across the street, posted up, had a table, selling it for, I think, $1 each, which price gouging at
with
its
inflation,
finest.
though. I mean, who knows? But
we had our girls with us, so we got some, and I partook just because.
I see those in my neighborhood. I'm never tempted to stop. So yeah, there's that. And then National Radio Day. Does anyone still listen to the radio? I have such a short commute that I don't really get much.
Yeah, I've got about 5 minutes, and pretty much if I listen to anything, it's just sports talk radio. So
yeah, my car's presets are Joy FM, my wife and kids, ESPN, and then whatever the other ones were set at when I bought the car. So, past that, we don't. But all right, well, it's going to be a good episode. We got some stuff we're talking about in Second Samuel, First Chronicles. We'll also be in Acts as well. But before that, let's kick it over to Jeremy. Let us know what's going next.
Today, we have a psalm brought to you by the Albatross's daughter-in-law, Nicole Byrd. Here it is.
This week we read Psalm 89, and what really stood out to me in this passage was the use of two words, steadfast love and faithfulness. Steadfast love was used 7 times and faithfulness 8. And I really think God intended us to realize that his steadfast love and faithfulness are never changing and they're never ending. He writes in verse 33, "But I will not remove from him my steadfast love or be false to my faithfulness." Verse 32 talks about how he will punish for transgression, for sin, but the awesomeness is that God's steadfast love and faithfulness will never be removed from us, even on our worst days. That I can trust and know with confidence that my God loves me and is faithful to me, even in those days when I'm not to him. And so that's just something that God taught me, and I'm so thankful that you've allowed me to share that with you.
All right, so this week we continued on in 2 Samuel. So we kind of left off. David is finally crowned king. He's finally over the 12 tribes of Israel. And the first thing that we see him do in chapter 6 is they go to move the Ark of the Covenant. He's wanting to bring it into Jerusalem where he's at and make it kind of the center of worship, the center of the nation of Israel. Mm-hmm. But we see that things don't quite go as planned. While they're transporting it, it says an ox that was apparently helping carry the ark stumbled, and the ark was about to fall. So one of the people near the ark reached out to keep it from falling and hitting the ground, seemingly, a good thing, right? But we see that in that moment, it says God in his anger strikes that man dead. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of a little bit of a shocking story, a little bit of a puzzling story, because, again, it seems like they're doing a good thing here, and God's reaction seems really extreme or really harsh. Yeah. How do we grapple with this? How do we understand what's happening here? And is it, I think there is an element of it being a harsh response, but is there more context here that we're missing? Anything that you would add that would help our listeners understand this passage better?
Yes. Yeah. First thing I think is we have to look back, we talked about it in the past, but the ark is God's presence with his people. It's where the presence of God to reside. So it's kind of this, they don't have a temple. So when they set up, like the ark goes into the middle of the temple when they actually set up the temple as they move, but it's the presence of God. So it's like the Holy of Holies. It's like, it's kind of a big deal. And so there's these like specific instructions too that God also gave for the transportation of it. And so it's not just, hey, they're moving some boxes and this guy Uzzah touches a box wrong. It's the most important thing, the presence of God. So it's a big deal in that regard, but it's also, they were not doing it the way God wanted them to do it. Like it's very clear from, I think back in like Leviticus, God lays out, this is how you're to carry this. And it like there's the guys with these like, kind of long poles.
Very specific roles and ways to do it.
And even to the amount of steps you take before something like happens, like it's very, very like detailed. And we can kind of look and say, well, that doesn't make sense. Why is that? Like, I think in our minds, it's, well, the ox makes sense. Like, like
they're stronger.
They've improved on God's idea, but hey, it's a message for us. Hey, you don't improve on God's idea. You do what God said, God's way, if you want it to work out. And so, like, I think there is the harshness, but it is just a picture of
God's
the holiness and presence of God matters. It's a big deal, and it's not something to be trifled with.
We in our sinfulness can't, be in contact, direct contact with God's holiness, or there are serious consequences. So I do think, like you said, there is a holiness factor here that it is serious, it is harsh response because God's holy and they're not, and when they touch the ark, that has serious consequences. But I do think we see later on, basically, that they end up putting the ark in someone's house, and that family is blessed by God because God's presence is dwelling with them. And David finally says, hey, we need to get the ark to Jerusalem where the whole nation can be blessed. And it seems like, in chapter 6, that second time when they go to move the ark, they do it differently. They do it according to God's plan. It talks about the people who were carrying the ark, not the ox who were carrying it. And it talks about the sacrifices that they made. And so you see there's just a difference in the way they approach moving the ark and getting it to Jerusalem. But it's still, again, it's a pretty shocking story. So we just wanted to make sure we touched on it because you can read that and kind of just be confused about what exactly is going on here.
Yeah, I think it's a good picture too of having good intentions isn't enough. Like we have to do things God's way. Like you have it was good intentions to use an ox. It was good intentions to reach out and stop it. But what did God say? That's what matters.
Right. Yeah. Doing it his way. Yeah. So they get the ark to Jerusalem. And then in chapter 7, we see this covenant between God and David. And I think we've talked about covenants all the way back in Genesis is where we see the first ones. But we see kind of this God's having this new covenant now with David, where David's desire, which seems it's a good desire, David wants to build God a temple, a house of worship. And instead of God saying yes, God says, no, you're not going to build me the temple. He says, your son will. But instead of you doing something for me, God promises these great blessings for David and for not only David, but all of his descendants, even to the point of, talking about establishing his kingdom and how his kingdom is going to, be a kingdom that lasts forever. And really, I think the most important thing to see here is that kingdom that God's talking about is not just the literal kingdom of Israel, the geopolitical Israel, but it's talking about the kingly line, the genealogy that when we read, for instance, the book of Matthew, right, we see that Jesus was descended directly from David, and that through Jesus, David's line did last forever, and it was a way that God carried on David's name and his family forever.
Yeah, I think too that even like we look at kind of the progression of the faithfulness of God through these covenants too. If you have like Abraham, hey, I'm going to make you a great nation. Like, okay, yeah, I get that, but this is even more like God's revealing Himself more in His plan more as He makes these covenants. That okay, yeah, I'm going to make you a great nation, but also you will be a royal, your line will be my kingdom is what is going to come through that. And he's starting to give a bigger picture, a more clear picture of what he will do to rule, to make things right again, to fix everything.
It's not that God's plan ever changed. It's just that as we work through the Bible and through human history, God is progressively showing his people what his plan is. And we kind of see this as a new element, a new wrinkle to it, where God is saying, hey, I'm going to send someone through the line of David who's going to establish a kingdom that lasts forever. And so, again, a clear foreshadow there of Jesus. So things are going well, right? David's finally king. The ark's in Jerusalem. God's promised to bless him. He's made a covenant with him. Yeah. And just when you think things are like really on a roll and things are going well and, man, this is awesome, we see that David's success and his victories are pretty much immediately followed by some pretty serious sin, starting in chapter 10, starting in chapter 11 with the story of David and Bathsheba. And so what is, I think it's a pretty familiar story. Adultery, then murder, and then his sin is exposed and he's caught and there's serious consequences. What are some things that we can learn or take away from these kind of dark passages or dark stories in David's life?
Yeah, well, I mean, one, and we've talked about a lot, sin is like serious. And so like, obviously that like carries through, but even like you look at the very first verse, it says in the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, right? David doesn't go. And so it's like, hey, you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing. And of course, you can walk through the whole story, and there's like different little things we can pick up through, but it's also like he put himself in a spot to sin. Like he's on his rooftop and he's looking down. It's not like, oh, he just happened to see it. It's like, hey, he looked, kept looking, and then sends his guys down to find out who this beautiful like woman is that he watched take a bath. Like there's continual, it's like, hey man, you made a mistake, okay, and then you compound it,
and then it just gets worse with Uriah, right? He's trying to cover up his sin to get Uriah to come home to sleep with his wife, so that if she's pregnant, it can be, maybe people will believe it's Uriah's son and not David's. And you see this crazy dichotomy of David going to great lengths to cover a sin and being really sinful and evil, and Uriah, this righteous man who's fighting for his country, who refuses to sleep with his wife because he has this camaraderie and this loyalty to David, to the country, to his fellow troops that he left, right?
But he's not going to, hey, I'm going to go home, be with my family in this. Right. I'm going to be with my men. Yeah.
Right. And so finally it gets to the point where David realizes, man, the only way I can, I guess, hide this is to basically have him murdered, putting him on the front lines. And so, you just see this compounding of sin, David going further and further to hide and to cover up his sin, which I think is, a warning to us that, we can, when we sin, we're faced with a choice in that moment. Do we own that sin? Do we confess that sin? Or do we hide it and do we cover it up? Do we ignore it? Do we try to pretend like it didn't happen? Do we try to justify it? Yeah. And we see, that our sin will be found out. And we've probably all experienced that in our lives at certain points. But I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned here about just the way that not only is sin serious, but when we sin, how do we respond to it?
Which is difficult as a confession of a sin is. It's not fun. It's not enjoyable. Yeah. And it is really, really bad in that moment, but it's always worse at a later moment because it does build and it does grow. And so it is that warning of, hey, you confess the sin that's painful and hard, but it's going to be a lot harder as it grows. And so we deal with it in the moment. And then you have this okay, there's a son that's born, but we see you have this Nathan, right? I mean, and this is a guy who's got some guts to him, right?
In front of the king, He
goes to the king and basically tells him this story. It's like a parable, if you will, of hey, there's a guy who takes what's not his and like tells us like story, and like, David is righteously angry and about like, hey, who's this guy who did this horrible thing to his neighbor? And Nathan, like, there's a point where he's like, okay, all right, maybe just stop the story and hope he gets it. But he's no, that's you.
You are that man.
Yeah. And it's just very harsh, but it's the truth being like revealed, and it cuts and it is deep. And to the credit of like David, he owns it and he confesses here.
He finally recognizes how much he screwed up. And you read Psalm 51, which we read this week, and that is a psalm of David's confession about this period in his life. And so we do know that he repents, but we see that there are serious consequences, right? This child is born, but because of David's sin, God tells him that this child will not live. And sadly, it says the baby lives for 7 days, but it's sick and it eventually dies. Which, this is kind of not something maybe you would think about if you just were reading through it quickly, but this passage specifically, a lot of times is used to talk about what happens to infants, children, even, sadly, situations like abortions. What happens to these kids, to these babies in their eternity, right? Do they spend eternity in heaven or hell? And I think kind of, to preface all this, our instinct is automatically like, oh, well, they have to go to heaven. And we'll get there, but I think that it is important just to say, like, hey, like, the Bible's clear that, like, the only way that we can come to faith and go to heaven is through, faith in Jesus. And if these babies, if these kids aren't expressing or showing faith in Jesus, can they go to heaven? But then you read the passage, and you see what David says.
Verse 23, I believe.
Yeah, in verse 23 where David says, but now he is dead, talking about his baby, why should I fast? And then he says, can I bring him back again? Which the implication is no. He says, I'll go to him, but he will never return to me. Right? And it seems like, what he's saying there is that he expects and believes that he will one day go to heaven and be with this child that he's lost. Which, again, it's difficult. We talked about this. Is this a grieving father, or is this, is it
like
truth?
theology?
Is it theological truth? And I guess I don't know that we can know with 100% certainty, but I think that we can read this verse and optimistically have hope and some level of confidence that we can have the same hope that David did.
I think that like God's word is clear. There's obviously they all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. So like we know that, and we also see this. And I don't have an answer. I think David Platt in one of the secret churches had a very, I feel like a godly approach to it of we don't know, but we know we serve a God who is gracious and merciful, and we can trust whatever choice he makes in it. And and I know it's a hard like topic because there's people that we know and love that have lost kids young, and like it is not just something that you take to like flippantly say, oh, well, here I'm going to make a judgment of this, but we know what God's word says and we can trust him. And I think that's kind of where we have to land on it.
Yeah. And we just want to make one quick note before we move to the New Testament about the book of Chronicles. So this week we read 13 to 20, a lot of, again, parallel passages to what we're reading in 2 Kings. But one big difference that if you're comparing them that you'll notice is that the book of First Chronicles does not talk about David and Bathsheba. It does not talk about some of David's sin, some of his mistakes, and which led you and I down the rabbit hole like, okay, well, why doesn't it include these things? And I think it kind of led us to the point where we had to take a step back and say, okay, why were these books written? The original author of, First and Second Samuel, First and Second Kings, and First and Second Chronicles. Why did they write the books? What was their purpose? And I think that kind of helps shed some light on maybe why some of these things are omitted. And so
first glance you have, okay, First Chronicles, this is kind of more of an official log of the kingdom, if you will. And so your cynical view, my cynical view at first was, oh, David's like, hey, this is not great. This is not good PR. let's keep that story out. But it is not necessarily that. You have this book was written, most people, I believe, in fact, I think the book even references it, the prophet Ezra is the one who wrote it. And it's a look back at a time, and it's written to the people of Judah. And so it's kind of more of Judah-centric. And so it's, hey, we're going to cover stuff that you need to know. We're going to cover this. But it's also to go with 1st and 2nd Samuel and Kings. And so it's not to be viewed as a separate thing. We kind of talked, it's kind of like, hey, when we look at our history books, American history, like George Washington, no one thinks he was a perfect guy. But when you read about the founding of America, what's vitally important, they pull out and say, okay, these are the things we need to know. Like he crossed the Delaware. He was the first president. Like there's certain things that are like, hey, these are the highlights that we hit. They don't include hey, there's certain things that he was wrong on this. He didn't do this right. It doesn't mean they're trying to wash over that. It doesn't mean that, hey, you're trying to clean up history. It's just what's vitally important for what we're writing now.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's important to understand is that, the book of Chronicles is being read alongside of 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. And so it's not like the author could hide these things from them because they could go back and they could read in these other stories about David's flaws. Yeah. It's just that the purpose of the Chronicles was to reflect on the past, specifically the kingly line that came from David, to focus on the tribe of Judah and to look ahead to the future of what God had promised and what he was going to do, and to inspire them to reach for and to look to model their lives and their kingdom after what David and Solomon did.
Yeah, which they were not perfect people, but it's more of, it's an archetype, if you will, of hey, this is the king. And then you look on and they compare back and forth to, okay, what does this perfect king look like? Not perfect, but it's also a reference to, hey, Jesus will one day be the perfect and true and better like David and true and better king. So
we'll see that theme kind of continuing throughout the book of Chronicles, but we did want to mention it this week. So I think with that, we will move on to the New Testament.
All right, we are also in Acts this week, and so kind of coming out of last week. Last week we kind of ended with God's calling Paul to go to Jerusalem. The people are saying, we don't want you to go. And then you have this prophet who basically says, hey, if you go, it's going to go poorly. Yeah. And he goes. And so we pick up with kind of Paul before the council in Jerusalem. Kind of walk us through kind of what we see here.
Well, yeah, I mean, the reason he's before them is because what was predicted came to fruition. He basically gets dragged out of the synagogue and almost beaten to death. And then, basically the soldiers come and get him because they think he must have done something wrong, even though he didn't. And so then we see really almost throughout the rest of the book of Acts, we see Paul kind of paraded before different people in different places at different times to defend his actions and, his life and his testimony. And again, a lot of that, with threats to his life and constantly in danger. And so that's kind of where we pick up in chapter 23 this week, where first he starts before the Sanhedrin, the religious leaders, the Jewish religious leaders, and they don't really want to hear anything he has to say. Obviously, they don't agree with him, and they don't believe that Jesus was the Messiah, that he rose from the dead. And so that doesn't really go very well for Paul. And then
Did you say it doesn't go well? I think my favorite part of this is verse 2, and the high priest, like Ananias, commanded those who stood by him to strike him on the mouth. Basically, punch him in the face. Yeah. We don't like what he's saying.
Right. So, I was putting it very mildly, right? It does not go well for Paul. And then we see he kind of gets shuffled around again to these different places. But one thing we were talking about in chapter 23, verse 11, it says that after he's brought into the barracks, it says, the following night the Lord stood by him and said, have courage, for as you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so it is necessary for you to testify in Rome. And so we see that in that moment, right, God shows up and he tells Paul, hey, I know it's been hard. I know it's been tough, but listen, don't be afraid, have courage, because the same thing that you're doing right now in Jerusalem, the testimony that you've told, you're going to do that in Rome too, which again, for us, if you look on a map, you're like, oh, well, Jerusalem to Rome, that's what, in a couple hour
flight,
But back then, that's,
weeks
spanning, across a large percentage of the known world at the time. And so that, I think gives Paul confidence through these next several chapters as he experiences a lot of persecution and affliction and suffering and pain. And so we see him endure through that, and we see the different opportunities that God gives him. But that kind of led us to have the discussion, obviously when we're experiencing not the same level of affliction or persecution that Paul is, but whenever we do go through hard times, we don't necessarily have, probably not ever. I've never had God speak to me audibly and tell me, hey, have courage. I know this is hard, but it's okay. Things are going to get better, or you're going to go here, or you're going to do that. A lot of times we're kind of left wondering, why is God letting this happen to me? What is going on here? And how should I act? How do I endure all of this? And so how do you think, again, we're not getting audible words from God like Paul is. How do we respond when we face those hard times, that difficulty, trial, persecution, whatever it might be?
Yeah, I think if you look at Paul, like there is comfort in God showing up for sure. That, hey, God is with him in his affliction. And we see that throughout the Bible. God is with us when we are going through hard times, that the presence of God does not leave us because things are difficult. At the same time, if you're Paul, like, hey, God's saying, hey, you're going to do this again in Rome. And if you're Paul, you're thinking, I'm here now. It hasn't gone well. Maybe we should try a different way. But I think it is that, hey, Paul had to resign himself to the fact already that, hey, I'm going to end up in chains.
Yeah.
I'm going anyway. We talked about that kind of like last week of, hey, go even when it's hard. But I think in terms of there's a thing we have to understand that we as the American church, I think, have a hard time grasping and like really living out of the embrace of suffering, that we shouldn't necessarily seek it out. In fact, like it's clear that we don't seek that out. But at the same time, we can't ignore what we read in James and Hebrews of that our faith is made complete through suffering. Like that, almost like that I cannot have a faith that is complete if I haven't gone through difficulties. And then that makes you step back and say, okay, my life as an American follower of Christ almost a lot of times is like centered around comfort or avoiding those things that are hard and difficult. And is that robbing me of a faith that is more complete?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, God does show up here and he gives Paul this message, but you'll notice the message doesn't say like, hey, Paul, everything's going to be okay.
Yeah.
You're not going to have to suffer anymore. Like, he doesn't give him any sort of assurances of that. He just says, hey, you're going to make it to Rome. And he does make it to Rome, but we see that he faces a lot of persecution on the way. And we know, at least from church history, that Paul was executed in Rome. And so, yeah, I do think that is a lesson that maybe as American Christians, we're just maybe not very well versed in what it means to suffer for Christ. But, I think it's 2 Timothy 3:16. All who desire to live a godly life will be persecuted, will suffer. And yeah, that reference you made to Hebrews, I think it's in chapter 4 where it talks about even Jesus, right? We know in the garden prayed that God would take this cup from him. And God heard that prayer, but God did not take that cup from him, right? Jesus suffered greater than any of us will ever suffer. And so there is this part of walking with Jesus that requires us in some way to suffer. And we see that played out in Paul's life right here in front of us in the book of Acts. But you also see how God provides these just really incredible and unique opportunities for him to share the gospel with government officials and leaders, people who he never would have had the opportunity to share with had it not been for that suffering and persecution that he endured. And so you see how God uses it, and how Paul remains faithful to God even through all of this. And, maybe probably for me, the most comforting verse in all the Bible as we suffer, as we go through hard times is Romans 8:28, that God works all things together for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose. Again, what is our good? It's not necessarily like what we think of, like health and wealth and everything going the way we want. It's that we would become more like Jesus, and that we would be, that our lives would reflect him in a more complete way.
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah, it kind of reminds me, like, God as our Father knows what we need more than we know and want to. And I mean, just an example, like, just my boys love to ride their bikes, and they will go out and ride their bikes, but there's times where it does not go well. They crash, they tip over, and there's that immediate kind of tears and pain. And in my flawed fatherhood at times, my initial just like gut reaction is, get up, you're fine. And shockingly, they do not respond well to that. But I think that that's what God is saying to us at times. Like, God's never saying, get up, it's okay. Like Paul's here, he's not just saying, it's okay, everything's going to be fine. But the times where my kids listen to me more, that they take more comfort almost in the fact that you say, hey, buddy, I know it hurts, but it's going to be better. Things will be okay. Like, you will get through this. And I think what Jesus is saying to Paul here is this, hey, it hurts, it stinks, it's not going to get better, it's going to happen again. But this picture of Paul running this race is basically God saying, you're going to finish the race, right? Yeah, the race isn't over because you're uncomfortable. You're going to finish the race. You're going to go through hard times, but you will make the finish line. You will do what you are called to do.
All right, well, that wraps up this episode of the Friday Lunchbox. Thanks for joining us. And remember, if you haven't been reading with us yet, or you're behind, that's totally okay. Just jump up and catch up with us where we're at. You can always find the reading plan online. Next week, we're going to finish the book of 2 Samuel. We'll read just one chapter in 1 Chronicles, finish Acts, and start the book of Romans. So 4 different books.
Busy week.
So thanks for joining us, and we hope that you'll join us next week. And always never forget and remember.
Does Jeff Rustin like to party? He does. Yeah, Jeff Rustin likes to party.